Hello, this is your host Akhil Navluri, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Techospace podcast series. In this podcast episode, I'm honored and thrilled to welcome our guest, Mr. Vaughan Moriondo, who happens to be an experienced leader in the IT industry. Now, having said that, I'm, finding this episode very, very special to me because, I'm actually collaborating with my mentor, and he was my senior delivery lead. Not many of you, and you're not aware of the fact that we both actually worked in a project together, and that was dating back in the year 2023, and we were working for an Irish company, and that project was completely into the finance domain. Now, having said that, Juan is based out of London, United Kingdom. So, Juan, it gives me an absolute pleasure to welcome you to this podcast initiative of mine. And Juan, our plan and our collaboration efforts have been like dating back since a year. So, how are you feeling at the moment? And
Yeah, yeah,
what are your thoughts on?
I'm good. I'm very good. Thank you, Akil. Yeah. 2023 seems almost like yesterday, almost in a way, but then an awful lot of water has gone under the bridge since 23. In terms of both of our moves and how we've moved around, and yeah, so you find me in good health in London, where the weather has been unseasonably good for the last month. And I'm pinching myself to think that I'm not in Australia or in India because the weather has been so great. So it's given
Yeah.
it's given what was a quite a long winter, and a sort of dull and dreary winter. Again, spring is absolutely here. The daffodils have been out and have now gone, and we're now heading into out of spring and into early summer, really. So yeah, and it makes getting up in the morning a lot easier as well when you got a blue sky.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, here in Victoria, I mean, this is like then Melbourne. It's a province called Victoria. So in Victoria, what happens is everyone there's always an inside joke of people here that we experience four seasons in one day. In the morning, you
Yeah,
see there's a blue sky, then you see there's chilly wind, then you see an overcast weather, and then you see the complete day is just falling gloomy. So it's it's just so
can
it's
be the
like an
same
ironical
here.
thing.
Can be the same here. 4 seasons in a day is not unusual.
Wow, then I think I think London and Melbourne clone on that for sure.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Brilliant, brilliant one. So, one again, I was just, I just wanted to understand, like, now when it came to the Easter thing, so did you have any chance of, going to any place in the UK, or did you happen to, travel this time?
I absolutely have a rule that I do not get in the car and travel anywhere at Easter. Because
Oh,
traveling in the car at Easter or getting on a plane prior to Easter is often a challenge, and more of a challenge to me than I want to take on. So I stuck pretty close to home. I spent a bit of time with my grandkids. I obviously had to go and deliver some Easter eggs. I've got five grandchildren that age range
oh,
between 19 and 3. So
okay.
I was with those families, and because again, the grandkids come from my 3 children that were born all in the 80s. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm giving away personal information now that is now going to be global. But no, it's fantastic time. The kids, yeah, Easter is a time for kids and a bit of overindulgence. It wasn't all chocolate. So for some of the boys, they got Lego, and their age ranges and the Lego purchase was dependent upon their technical ability to be able to build Lego. I still can build Lego, as I found out with my 3-year-old, that I was helping him build a racing car that I bought for him on Lego. So yeah, I had a great Easter. Treated myself and a friend on Easter Sunday for an Easter lunch in a very
All right.
nice restaurant, and yeah, and then all of a sudden it was all over, and we're on into the next period, which is for me is May, and there's 2 bank holidays in May.
Oh,
But I'm pretty busy as well at the moment. So yeah, I'm we're well into the year, aren't we? It's almost, it was January and then it's suddenly almost May. So
Right. Exactly. I mean, time is just flying here and it's so surprising. And now you were just saying that you are having bank holidays in May. Now talking about me, next week again I'm off to the uni and again starting with
yeah,
my assignments, attending classes. So the same routine for
yeah,
me again.
yeah. Cool. You work hard, sir. You work hard. I'm sure you will.
Definitely one for sure. Yeah. So one at the stroke of this hour, which is 8:18 p.m. in Melbourne, let's kick off with our podcast episode. So one,
Great.
can you give me a deep insight of starting your journey way back in the 1980s? So how did that start?
Yeah, again, a whole set of circumstances, luck was involved with it. The luck of finding an organisation that I knew of, I knew of because I was providing a service to this particular company, a computer rental and leasing company that worked for. That was a distributor for some of the big manufacturers like Hewlett Packard and Digital Equipment and Tektronix. So I knew of the business. It was called Hamilton Rentals, and I started with Hamilton Rentals on the 3rd of March 1980. Um, from knowing them, but also having opened an evening paper and seeing an advert for salespeople for Hamilton Rentals in what was a paper called the Evening News that no longer exists. It died a number of years ago. And from that start date of the 3rd of March, and I'll never forget the date, but I interviewed for it in late January, I think, of that, early February, and I started in March with giving notice to my previous company. Yeah, I fell on my feet with a bunch of people, and a business opportunity, and with no real knowledge of IT. Yeah, I started and worked my way through the organisation with people that I still associate with today. So people that I'd worked with that then became friends. Lives change, people move apart, but again, so my mentor, you were talking to me about, the mentorship that we have going. One of my mentors, Nick Moulton, is still very much a part of my life. He retired a number of years ago, but I haven't. So he obviously did something that I didn't. But to be honest, I love working, so I don't want to retire. To be honest, but back to the 80s, yeah, it was a whole voyage of opportunity, challenging but very rewarding, and that was the grounding. And I think, as we perhaps discussed in the past in sort of preambles, I started before there was a PC. That seems hard to reconcile now, but there wasn't a PC. Yes, Mr. Gates was with his colleagues, DOS was available, but there wasn't a PC that you could go and buy. And then when they did, and I think it was in 81, Digital Equipment started bringing out PCs, and then that followed by the other manufacturers. Yeah, that today, to try and explain that to my 17-year-old daughter, that there weren't mobile phones and there weren't PCs and there weren't tablets and the like, is completely foreign. But that's exactly how it was. So, I was in the era of technical workstations, mini computers as they were, because we were still, in the 80s, we were still seeing the remnants of, well, not the remnants. Mainframe computing was still very much there. Punch card was still very much there in those early 80s until they were replaced. So yeah, I've seen life in the IT industry over a number of decades, and each decade brings on both new opportunities, fantastic advances in technology and software, that I've been a part of basically all of my life since I was in my early 20s.
Brilliant one. So one, when you just got this feeling, or let's say when you were when you were told that you have to embark on this journey into the IT space. So what was your inner feeling like? Did you have that feeling, okay, I'm gonna make it big, or did you feel like, oh, this is pretty new for me? So what was it like?
No, there was a certain degree of trepidation because, confronted with what manufacturers were offering at a time, or what we were offering as a service to our customers at the time. I can remember in my sort of first week, first month of being, I went. My boss Nick said to me, right, you need to understand what we're selling. You don't need to worry about how a Hewlett Packard 9845 works, but you need to know its features and benefits. And I was given a bunch of crib sheets effectively from the manufacturer, and quickly I learned it was just a numbers game. It was just understanding what the numbers were. If it was an HP 9845 or a 9835, the first thing you recognise was the price point, and a 9845 was £15,000, let's say, and the 9835 was 20,000, or whatever, what the price differential. So I would look to try and sell up. I always wanted to sell up if I possibly could. So understanding features and benefits, and the price point, because we were paid on revenue and profit and revenue, and so I quickly learnt the numbers quickly to benefit me and my commission package, because we had a basic package, and then you made commission on top of that. And I was, very keen to earn commission. I had a young family at that stage, and I was the only breadwinner. So you obviously, I was going to be going for doing as much as I could on a month basis, and growing with it. And again, very fortunately, I had some good people behind me, in the business, and a very supportive wife. And I went out there and just did it. And I have to say, I loved every minute of what I did, right the way through the 80s, Akhil. Loved it.
Amazing. I mean, when I'm hearing it from you regarding the 80s, I feel like, I should go back to that time because, I'm a fan of the 80s music and I always used to feel that, what if I was born during that era? Because I'm not a big fan of today's music. No offense on that.
No,
But,
no,
but,
no.
again,
I mean,
80s
again,
period. Yeah.
it was because we were free, basically. I mean, I knew what I had to achieve in a month, and when I say free, there were no mobile phones. I had to plan my week in advance and send my call my where I was going to be in the week. I think in the early 81, I think we were given a bleeper. The doctors used to use a bleeper where it would be on your belt, and if the bleeper went off, it would just tell you to ring office, ring home. It was very, very basic technology. But otherwise, if the bleeper didn't go off, you just did your week's work and the submit your call report, and how many orders and that was it. So there was no interference once you were gone, um, for the week. And again, what I also realised soon on, the more I was out of the office, the better, because I was typically in front of clients and doing what you need to do for a client, delivering. And so the other people had different ideas about that. Some of my colleagues like to be in the office more. I always like to be out of the office and gone and meeting new people, finding fresh challenges, and doing it in that way. And that's how I think I thrived during the 80s, by being that type of salesman, if you like, and getting to know the customers, and the customers getting to know me. And what, again, and I've, as we perhaps go through the podcast, it is about being yourself as a salesman, whether it's you're a salesman, whether you're a program manager or a program director. It's just being yourself and not trying to be something that you're not.
Exactly. Agreed. Totally agreed on that. Yeah. So, one, like now, I just wanted to understand, like, one, what was majorly your drive to transition all the way into the software solutions? Like, how did you get that thought, to transition all the way into it?
Well, I think it's all about when you've been there and done it, and you think that you can't go any further. What are the fresh challenges? And for me, through the 80s, and effectively, I worked for two companies in the 80s and the early 90s. Of the original company that I worked for, Hamilton's. 11 of us left Hamilton's to form a new company, which we then took on into the early 90s. And effectively, we were offering the same service, but I would say that when I transitioned across to a company called ICS, which was a complete new company that we formed, I was taking all the goodness with me and many of the people that I loved working with and for. And so by the early 90s, although very successful in the transitioning, I was looking for something more than that. And obviously, the products that I was selling, which was effectively sale, rental, and leasing, I'd done it. I'd done that to death. And I'd made an awful lot of money, and I'd enjoyed everything that I did. But I was looking for a fresh challenge, and that came in the shape of an organisation that an old friend of mine had gone to work for. The company was called Infotech, and they were providing software built on a Unix platform to the banking sector, which through the 80s and 90s, my key customers were banking, finance, engineering, because the product portfolio that I had fitted those criteria. The engineering side of it then through the 90s faded away, and my focus then became banking and finance, because to be truthful, that's where the money was. That's where the big money was. Because obviously the banking and finance industry was, it made its money about in terms of understanding risk and then delivering on that. And again, when I joined Infotech, it was a data distribution service that we were providing, and decision support for trading. And the decisions that people made based upon the software that we were selling, particularly in decision support, made banks millions and squillions if they got it right. I was very lucky to work with a company that was very progressive there. And yeah, I have to say it was quite a jump from sort of 11, 12 years of doing what I'd been doing on a repetition basis, because every bank wants something slightly different. There was nothing so customizing what the bank wanted and delivering on that requirement was challenging. It was challenging from not only some of the technology that was being used at the time, but also time to deliver that, and also trying to keep organisations' feet on the ground, because in anything, and including today, um, the opportunity for business leaders to say, fine, okay, well, we want this much, but can we squeeze a bit more? Can we get a bit more? And the answer is, of course, you can, but as a result of that, the project always goes to the right, because what originally is set and then what's reset has a massive bearing. So again, this is where I started to realize how important it was to manage customers' expectations in that software field, in exactly the same way as I'd managed expectations in the hardware field for the previous 10 or 12 years of doing it. So and yeah, people always want to push it. Even in today of agile. Again, we've got some experience. We've got some joint experience of that. people always want to push it. They always want to push it a bit more. But as a result of pushing it a little bit more, it pushes time out, and then you get a customer that is not happy because they believe you haven't delivered. What you need to make sure is that they understand the implications of pushing it a bit further and having more enhancements. It's gonna kill the original timeline. So if they're prepared to accept that, that's fine, but not always. Business and end users and the senior leadership team don't always necessarily see that in clarity, with clarity, I'd say.
Got it, got it. So that's completely understandable on that. Now, Vaughn, you just were, touching upon a point called the data. So today I was just having a conversation with my father when he was just telling me that earlier there was a time where, data portability was not good enough, where you were trying to extract the data, molding the data well with the data types. So Vaughn, during your tenure, did you ever experience that when you were, working with projects having the banking sector and the financial domain?
Yes, yes, I did. And you saw me puffing my cheeks out there because we've never discussed this actually, and I've got to be slightly careful as to how I frame it. But there was a period of time that I worked for a very large German bank, delivering what was a critical transitional program for them. So ETL was a big part of that, and getting the data extracted in the right way was critical to the overall success, and also it brought about. There were, as you well know, in the banking sector, reporting accurately on your true position. If the regulator has either fined you or is in the process of fining you for breaches, there is a lot at stake. And but that's again always been the case. Obviously, as we got into the early noughties, those fines were ratcheting up significantly. Regulators were becoming wise, or more wise, to what organisations were doing, perhaps reporting what wasn't in fact as accurate as it should be, and then being fined on that. Um, the whole ETL thing, what in the 80s was a bit of a yeah, um, there was structure behind it, but there was also um, there were also areas where you had to engineer workarounds.
Yeah.
What a regulator might see was that it was a very very calm surface of water, but behind it there was a raging storm, and it wasn't just about using the right tools. It was also often having to have teams of people in back offices, looking at the data that had been extracted and then manipulating that data to get it to be right, because the ETL wasn't right, or there were elements of the data that were corrupt or just inaccurate. um, I've seen some things where people say, yeah, this ETL is working really really great, and that was the outward view. But often behind the scenes there were hundreds stroke thousands of people across different you know financial organizations that were behind the scenes, altering the data to get it right, to get it accurate, to report on it, and therefore then not to be fined again when a regulator actually said, actually you've slipped up here, and we're gonna fine you 50 million of whatever dollars because you haven't hit the mark. So yeah, as I said, I've not discussed that before, but yeah, again, working across the various organisations that I've worked with over the last decades or so, um, I would say now that things are a lot less dependent upon manual workarounds and teams of people working feverishly 12 72 hours a week a person to try and get it right. I think it's a lot more accurate now, as advances in technology have taken place. To be honest, and again, it was the Wild West in the early noughties in terms of the ETL tools that were available to you, and there were numbers. I'm not going to name any in particular because I think they were all basically a much of a muchness, and you just decided which flavour you were going to go with on the basis of the problem that you were trying to solve.
Agreed. That's completely, agreeable on that fact. When you were talking about the ETL thing, I mean, there was a lot of compliance based on that, and a lot of rules and
Yeah.
regulations, circulating around it. So now, if I would just like to, ask you this, I mean, I'm aware of the fact, or I've been, told that you were completely into, selling and, into selling and renting the mini computers. So I just wanted to understand this, like, what was your thought process of venturing into that domain or the space?
Um, well, computing in the 80s was, again, the cost of some of the things that I, many computers that I was selling at the time, computational workstations, graphics workstations, they were very, very expensive. But also the market was moving very quickly. So from the client side, the reason that rental and leasing um, came to the fore in that period was to be able to move swiftly, to be able to get something on somebody's desk, um, to get around budget constraints. Because surprising, it's not surprising to hear that there was as many, if not more, budget constraints in the 80s and 90s as there are today. Capital versus on or off balance sheet, all were very all were very relevant to the organisations that I was selling to, so both banks and engineering. Um, Market opportunity drives things like rental. So, in other words, if you see a market opportunity, let's just say in an engineering, for the sake of not always going to banking, but from an engineering point of view. So basically, you have got drilling rights in the North Sea for a particular well, and again, it's all about you, BP, jumping ahead of Shell or Exxon or whoever it was. You wanted to get your engineers working feverishly as quickly as possible to get that opportunity out of what was under the ground, out of the ground. So that's why rental and leasing was so popular in
Yeah.
the 80s and 90s, in just being able to jump on that market opportunity. No different really to banking, but I'm just using the experience that I had in terms of engineering. And in fact, from an excitement point of view, oil and gas was much more interesting and challenging, because you were going, I wasn't walking into the city of London and walking into a bank. I was getting up to Scotland and getting in a helicopter and being flown out onto an oil rig or onto a pipeline barge out of Rotterdam, so some of the things that I did then that I reflect on now, I go, did I really do that? And the answer is, I really did that. Um,
Yeah.
um, and so therefore that was that, and again, it was about giving your customer, accurate information about what we could put where and by when, and that we could get it operational. So again, I've spoken in the past with you about, one of the most important words that I ever learnt really to use effectively was no. No, I can't do that by Friday, but I can get it to you by Monday at 9 o'clock. So not overselling the opportunity, and that has been the common thread through my career. So going right back to the 80s, some of the things that I did on a Friday afternoon, if a customer rang and said, you know, this is Brown and Root Halliburton, can you deliver me the following today? And the answer is, the only way in which I could do that was to load that into my company car and drive to Collier's Wood and get it there before 5 o'clock. There was no other way of doing it. And again, that's been my simple process that I've followed year on year in industry, in terms of saying, well, no, I can't. And if I couldn't at all, the other really more important to that is, no, I can't, but I know somebody that can. So, giving somebody a solution to the problem. Because if I knew I couldn't deliver something on a Monday and they needed it because they needed to fly it to wherever, I would say, well, why don't you try? Why don't you try MBIS, who were a competitor of ours in the time that I said they may be able to help you. But giving somebody, an option, even though you can't fulfill it yourself, those people remember that. And again, it's really simple stuff. At the end of the day, is trying to be as helpful as you possibly can, and truthful and honest.
Agreed. So, I mean, when did you exactly learn this word to, say that, okay, no, I mean, it's hard to, always say no, but like, when did you get that feeling, okay, this is the right time I need to, exactly come up with this sentence, stating, okay.
Yeah, it wasn't a learnt thing. It was an instinctive thing, and it probably almost certainly comes from my background. So my father and my grandfather, and in terms of being straight, basically very straight, in terms of, if you know you can't do something, you've got to put your hand up. The same applies if for me is if, and over the years, don't get me wrong, I've made mistakes. Is making sure you own up to those mistakes, and it's only from observation. It's observation from seeing people that haven't been totally honest and haven't held their hand up or have under delivered against expectations. The success rate for those people is, I hate this word, but it's suboptimal. Because
Right.
people get to know, and then so the trust that might have been built up can very easily crumble away, and my way of reconciling that is that people that I was selling to and providing services to in previous decades are still people that I speak to, if not on a weekly basis, certainly on a monthly or a quarterly basis. They may very well have retired, at some of them at that, and that some of them have. But that's, again, it comes back to the basic, simple principles of being honest with yourself and honest with the people that you're providing a service to. And as I said, I think ultimately that goes back to my heritage, but go back to my father. My father was in the motor trade for 38 years, and my grandfather was in finance,
Oh,
going back in the 50s and 60s. And I took a huge amount. I spent quite a lot of time with my grandparents and my grandfather when I was in my between 6 years of age and 12 years of age. He was still working. My grandfather was still working, and he was the head of a finance company. And so therefore I learned a lot from him by listening to his stories that I've just sort of carried through, and then through my father, again, about how you treated customers, how you work, my father in particular, how hard he worked with customers, and working for an organization. He worked for the same Ford dealership for 18 years, and so a lot of my time in my between 5 and 11 was spending Saturdays at my dad's dealership, and doing things, and then it followed on from that. So again, I think an awful lot of what what I found that works for me has been, observation, you know,
Yeah.
observation across from family to the whole trust element that I've touched on, looking people in the eye, and delivering. And again, it's not any more complicated than that. I think so many people want to make it more complicated, particularly now. I think I think now things are so much more complicated. I mean, getting orders, signing off big, 7 or 8 numbered deals in the past were easy. Trying the internal mechanisms that you have to go through today are so much more complex. I call it order prevention, and that's order prevention from the organisations that you work in. In the decades leading up to that, you got a deal. You read the T's and C's, which were typically 2 pages of T's and C. Now that's it, and everybody is worried about being sued and litigious in terms of if you don't deliver. It's very, very different today. So I'm again, you learn to cope with that. But it is, I mean, again, I've got some friends that are doing just that sort of thing now, particularly when they're not selling direct, you're selling indirect through distribution. That is just, indirect sales. I've never worked in indirect sales,
Hmm.
and I never would, because you're never in control. And you how can you forecast business when you've got somebody in the middle between you and the client, and they're not as good as you are? Again, that's something that I see even more of today with some of the people that I still am associated with and have worked with. I'm bound to get a phone call later on today from a friend of mine called Stuart, uh, and he's been pulling his hair out on a particular deal for nearly 90 days now, nearly 3 months. The customer wants to sign it, but there's somebody in the middle that's making it more difficult. So,
Yeah.
but again, that's how, I don't think I don't think that's helpful at all for anybody. I think the other thing that has made selling more difficult today, I mean, we all know who Salesforce are, don't we? But the whole concept about reporting and reporting up, um, uh, where it should be that it's a transparency of what is the actual, is so often not. And the example I've just given in terms of if you've got a middleman, if you've got you're selling in an indirect model, that I could not cope with that. So that's why
Exactly.
I've not been involved in that market, and never would, not for any money.
Absolutely. That's completely agreeable one, because everything has to be transparent and pretty clear. You cannot just have a middleman kind of an approach going on, and the
Well,
things become a bit confusing, like how the how things are
yeah, it
flowing.
yeah it pushes the deal cycle out without a shadow of a doubt. So it makes, for the customer, it makes it more difficult, and for the from the source, it makes it that much more easy when you're going via a distributor of whatever size and whatever competency and market position that they're in. It makes it very complicated, because if you are from the source, you don't necessarily ever connect with the client. You know who it's
Exactly.
going to, but it's all controlled by the intermediary.
Indeed, indeed, for sure. So now heading on for the next one. So one, like, can you familiarize me and our listeners with the concept of a storage management company? Because, we would really like to know more about it. So, like, what's your take on it?
Yeah, yeah, and that was end of the 90s, or 97 to 99, I think. Storage management was a market opportunity that myself and my colleague John were approached by a big disc manufacturer um, to start an end user business in network storage. They wanted a presence in terms of not just via distribution. They wanted a end user business, and I had no knowledge of storage management whatsoever. I would say I still really don't. I had to learn quickly, um, and we formed a company called Zenstone Storage Systems, based out of a town in Hertfordshire called Hemel Hempstead, and it was very much a market opportunity. It was a bit like cowboys and Indians, really. It was a bit like the Wild West.
All right.
But again, it's a bit like anything in sort of emerging technology. Everybody knew it was really important to get to use the benefits of network storage. And some won in terms of some were successful and some were not so successful. I'm pleased to say that we were pretty successful. We did it. So John and I formed this company with financial backings from a big distributor, um, European distributor, and went into the marketplace in mostly financial services, because that's where the market opportunities were at that time, and people were still, even in late 90s, prepared to take risks. And yeah, we did very well. We did very well to a point whereby we went back to the distributor that had funded our startup. We had not solely funded; we put money in ourselves as well, and we wanted to. We were finding that the business was being sort of held back or constrained because the distributor didn't understand end user business, didn't understand the differences that were subtle to some extent and then obvious in others. And so therefore John and I decided that we would like to buy ourselves out and take the company on ourselves and go off and make multi-millions from it. Very, in terms of we were successful, but not in the way in which we wanted to be successful, because the company then declined our offer that we had placed, and in fact gave us two very nice checks to go away, because they decided that they wanted to do it and didn't want us to do it. But in terms of a short period, and it really was a short period, it was 2 years. We went from zero to a very interesting business model that we thought that we would take on and be successful with, and as we had been, but our funders and founders, in terms of the distribution company, thought they could do it better. I'm not going to tell you the end of the story as to whether they did better than we did, but it
All
was.
right.
But again, we the first 12 months was hard. The second 12 months and into the sort of third year, we were very successful, because we'd been very good at what we had done in that initial setup, and taking a set of products to the market that the market wanted. So it's a time that because we've just sort of discussed what I did at various stages. One thing then always then leads to another, and again, I've always been. I wouldn't say I've been a risk taker, but I wanted to always challenge myself, and I'm still of that mind today. I'm challenging myself today and what I'm going to be doing for the next three or 4 years. Um, and where I'm currently, in terms of what I'm doing and what my aspirations are, are pretty much the same as they were, except the fact that I'm an awful lot older now than I was when I was doing it when I was in my 20s. But I still love that challenge. I like. I don't want to just sit here always learning something slightly different, and adapting to the circumstances that are presented to you going forward. And again, that's why I'm happy to be here today, um, just talking about the past, because that's, again, hopefully our listeners will find some of this of interest and not boring. But also continue to challenge where we are today and how much better we can be going forward, and with the wealth of knowledge that we have behind us, whether or not we're young and fresh faced like you, Akhil, or old and grizzled like me.
Totally, totally agreed. I totally, vouch on that statement and totally agree with that. So, one now, when you were talking more about the storage management company, do you feel that that kind of a concept is, still relevant today, or do you feel, I mean, it's not that relevant, or do you feel that, it can be integrated with some kind of, a backend technology? Like,
Well, typically now, that was almost standalone at the time. It wasn't a part of an integration. It was how many disks could you spin up in a cabinet to give the compute power that you needed at the time. It's now looked more as an integrated solution. Um, is my understanding. So I left all of that behind. I left that behind, and then subsequently went off and worked for a systems integrator. Um, so it was a natural progression, really, and there is less of that sort of market opportunity as a sort of single thread than there is now. It's much more an overall integrated solution, which is both challenging, because we all know that systems integration can be very successful or very costly when it doesn't work. So again, it was of its time. The whole network storage, network management solutions were, and they were very individual. They were you were in this camp or that camp or another camp in order in predicated on what market sector you were in. And if you're in banking, you would go down one particular line more than not. And if you were in engineering, or if it was in another sector of the market, I think it sort of played out according to where everybody else was going. You know, it was a bit lemming. If I say the lemming mentality, if everybody was jumping off the edge of a cliff in
okay.
banking and finance, they were jumping on there was no, but there were a few people that say, actually, we're not going to do that. We're going to go another way. Um, so that's how I read it at the time. I believe I'm correct in that regard.
Yeah, you are absolutely, apt with respect to that because things keep on changing. And yeah, you have to, it depends on the situation again. In your experience as a, as a program director slash a program as a project manager, like what are the key takeaways that you have gathered in this, in this rapid growth of technology? Like, do you see a lot of changes happening, or do you see, okay, they're pretty, pretty steady, or let's say pretty brisk?
Well, again, I, I've sort of alluded to this already. The whole program management, program director roles that I've been involved with are all about really one of the same thing. It's how accurately can you deliver the outcome that the client wants, and how to manage and control that client. Um, because of scope creep, whether or not you're using low code, no code, whatever it is you're delivering, there is always the temptation. There's always the business is always pushing for more. It's whether or not on the client side where the business is pushing for more, and we saw it firsthand, did we not? And the delivery
Yeah,
side of the client was saying, "Oh, we'll see what we can do," and then coming back to us and going, "Well, Vaughan, can we bring this in? Can we bring this a month earlier than we'd originally scheduled?" Well, no, we can't. No,
exactly.
we
Yeah.
we can't. But this is where within businesses, both medium and large, are so often fall over in exactly the same spot is how it's internally managed. It's, if the vision at the top is not communicated down correctly to the people that do the work, and then don't the people that do the work on the client side don't communicate with the supplier, that's when it all starts to go wrong, because you then get pressure down. So the doing side of the client side, are being pushed down from, and they're not pushing back up and saying, do you know what, that funny old word, no, we can't do that because our supplier says we can't. So, it's going to go right. If you want us to do that, it's going to go right. You won't hit that red mark. So, and I don't believe it will ever really ever change. I really don't see it, because of the pressures and poor communication, poor management, also poor delivery in some respects. Again, when you start to push something out of shape, because the clients asked you to do that, it has a knock-on effect, and inevitably that leads to it going right. So I, again, it's about how you try and work with the client to get them to understand that what's being asked of is fair enough. I understand why they want more and quicker, but just dropping half a dozen more developers in, or another project manager in, isn't going to get the answer that you want.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work. So we'll drop another 10 in. So can we bring it in 2 weeks earlier? No, you can't, because it doesn't work like that. And again, the principle is so basic that I don't understand why people don't see it. The client side don't see it. Many of them do. Don't get me wrong, but an awful lot don't. And typically, as I've been involved with, certainly in the last 10 years, programs that have either I've either failed or are failing. You go back to the basic fundamentals of what and the components of why it's failed so far, and then what you need to do to rectify that. And again, it's not particularly rocket science either. Again, I think we've seen firsthand, with clients that we have in common, that the push is always there, and that's understandable. It's how you manage that process, and the clarity that you take back, in terms of what you can and what you can't do. Um, uh, and again, that's a fundamental that just carries on.
I totally get that point. One, yeah, that's a point that completely sums up. Now, one, if I would just like to ask you this particular question, like, what is your view about the agile methodology and the DevOps? Do you feel that I mean the former is superior over the latter, or the latter is superior over the former? So, which one do you would recommend over that?
Um, well, I think agile is spelt differently, as to where you sit in the process, and a lot of people talk it, but a lot of people don't walk it. So again,
Yeah.
I think it's one of those, it's one of those areas that, eh, people think they understand it, but they actually don't really understand it. And again, firsthand, I've seen that on a number of occasions. I think there's also another. I think there's also another element to it, dependent upon on the client side, um, who's leading a project, and whether or not they are, not truthfully reporting internally where the project actually is and where it's likely to end up. Um, we have things like RAG reports, do we not? And we have weekly and monthly, delivery, meetings. And again, I'm minded of situations that I've been in over the years. What you report back as as to how you're delivering the outcome, whether agile or DevOps, is all about reporting accurately the true position of where you are. It's also very significant, I think, in terms of particularly these days, in terms of agile, of the accuracy of when you present something to a client as a pre-delivery, that you've got the right people involved in that in those meetings. On the whole agile, no code, low code area, there is an absolute I mean, it screams at you every time, because the manufacturers predicate what they can deliver on the basis of a a 2-month delivery window on the basics of a pilot, and then running it and then going live. The the vast majority of organisations that I've been involved in the last 10 years typically assemble a project team that isn't a project team. It's they deliver people that will be involved in the project, but they're doing that, to coin a phrase, from the side of their desk, and so their involvement is not 100%, and so therefore, again, if that's an imperfect situation, and it's and as a supplier, there's nothing much you can do about that other than to call it out. And again, I think that therefore makes this whole concept of agile, if people approach it in that way, not agile, suboptimal, again, using that famous phrase. So yeah, there are examples where that doesn't happen, and some of the, again, work with a couple of big, high street banks over the last 5 or 6 years, who do have dedicated teams, and insurance companies for that matter, who have bitten the bullet and not asked people to work at the side of their desk, and as a result of that, you see a much more successful outcome as a result. But you've got to have ultimate support at the top of the organisation, and you've got to have a budget that is correctly aligned to the staffing required in order to hit the mark. Simple as that. And there's some great examples of where organisations have done that, and the success they've had. The one that probably screams out to me, that I've seen over the years, that screams that, is, funnily enough, not in the banking sector. It's in the insurance sector, and Aviva was one of those organisations that basically, used the technology, got the right people together, and then have transformed themselves as a business from a what was a pretty mediocre service delivery, Norwich Union it was used to be called, and all the various companies that they've acquired over the years. But they've turned their business around, and whether you're ringing today about your dog insurance, or whether you're ringing about your pension, or whether you're ringing about your car insurance, they all knit together. Aviva is a classic example of getting it right from the position that I've seen with that. And I'm just not picking. I'm only picking them because I know the backstory to it, and I've been to the conferences, and I've seen the CTO stand up and talk about how they did it, and why it was successful, and why they were there on the stage trying to preach to others that it could be done if it was approached in the right way.
That's brilliant one. I mean, this is the first time, I'm just hearing it, and it's interesting that, that's one successful story about an insurance company. And I've heard about like many insurance companies, having that success story, but hearing it from you, one, it actually makes it much more insightful. And
Yeah, but don't forget that they came from an imperfect position, like many organisations, particularly organisations that acquire in order to get bigger. I would say, I think it's still the case that people acquire business, or organisations acquire businesses and then don't integrate them. And I've worked in so many, both small, medium, and large opportunities where, Vaughan, can you come along? We need somebody to help us do this. And you then start to peel back the layers of the onion, and in terms of the businesses that are within their empire, that they bought them in 2005 and it's 2020, and they're running as standalone businesses still, when the opportunity, and then they're looking at their costs and going, geez, this is costing us 20% more than it was this time last year. Oh, why is that? Well, that's because they bought other businesses and haven't integrated them. So that is common, and it happens in massive organizations, and it happens in small and medium.
Absolutely.
But and again, and why is that? I would say the reason for that is fear.
Yeah.
Fear of failure. And cost, of course, and there is a cost as that. But
Cost is a big
uh,
thing that hits hard.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But fear, I would say fear is probably overriding that of cost to transition and integrate.
The insight one that you have given me, I would just like to add my own twist to it. So, you were just telling that everyone starts from a very, from a very bad position, of, coming up. Everyone has ups and downs. So I would, relate this to more like a football team in the Premier League, or let's say any football league in the world, where they're, almost facing relegation, and they're, having that typical financial crunch, but again they are upgrading themselves by improving their academies. I mean, improving their youth
Mhm,
system. So probably
mhm.
I would just like to correlate that with this.
Yeah, yeah. My son, one of my son-in-laws, is a coach in a national league here in the UK, and we speak about his challenges that he has with his
Oh.
players, with his chairman. I'm not going to say any more. I'm not going to mention his name. And
All right, all right. No, no, no
but
worries,
but
you
but
shouldn't.
but you're right. But you're absolutely right. It is, and at this particular time of the season, it's all about playoffs. And will this particular team that my son-in-law is the head coach for,
Okay.
will he move up to the next level?
Okay.
And the hope is that he will. But in order for that to happen, in terms of in my reading of it, all of the right building blocks have got to be in place. And if you haven't got all of those building blocks in place, the chances are that they won't get up to the next level unless everything has been like, it's about putting down the firm foundation. And
Exactly.
if the firm foundation means that you've got to invest more wisely, and I think we've all seen plenty of examples of unwise investment in the football arena. It doesn't matter if you've got billions, and it doesn't matter where those billions come from in the year. If you're not in control, and that you're not the conductor, or the coach, or you're not, the chances are that you will get relegated, or you'll lose
Absolutely.
your job if you're the coach. And we know how many coaches have lost their jobs,
Oh
over
God.
over the years in the Premiership mostly. But yeah, so again, it all boils down to the
Absolutely.
foundations, and the
Exactly.
foundations that you've set out.
Truly, truly. If the foundation isn't strong enough, then it's really hard for the team to, sustain, and everyone starts crumbling down with respect
Yeah,
to that.
yeah, and it's expectations. I mean, obviously, in some of the lower leagues, I've only found out really about this recently. Even lower leagues, it's essential that you communicate accurately what you're doing. Otherwise, people pick up on a thread that might be completely incorrect that suddenly goes around the whole team. And then what happens? You lose the dressing room or whatever the expression is
Yeah,
because of maybe one or two things that were not correctly communicated. Again, communication.
communication, exactly.
Act on.
Exactly. That's a vital thing. Yeah. Absolutely. It's more like, sometimes I've heard of that, people they have a divide with the, with the manager, or let's say the coach of the team, and that's where the team starts, losing their rapport, and it just goes in a
Yeah,
very bad state.
yeah, and again, expectation setting. Suddenly, let's just say, for instance, um, the chairman comes in and says halfway through the season, guys, you're doing really, really well, and it's fantastic. And in early January, we're all going to go to Amsterdam for a long weekend, and I'm gonna pick up on the flights and the hotels, and the rest of it is down to you. We'll have a couple of dinners here and there. But then if the chairman suddenly decides he's looked at his bank account and he's gone, oh, I don't know, I want to afford that amount of money anymore. We're not doing it. I'm using a sort of an example. Um, the,
Maybe,
the
yeah,
the
yeah.
the the players' heads go, do you know what? That's really unfair because we're actually still up there in the sort of playoff positions, and he's decided that we're not doing that anymore. And all of a sudden, the word, yeah, but again, that happens on delivery teams.
Exactly.
That happens. So again, you can directly, you can see the common threads that run through. And
Exactly,
it's
yeah.
isn't that just that's just life, whether it's football or whether it's program delivery for a finance house or an insurance company. It's not that dissimilar.
Truly, yeah. That's where the connect, actually clones upon with. So now one, again, I mean, going back to the same thing. So as a, as a program director slash a program, as a project manager, like who are the leaders who have inspired you the most in your entire journey?
I mean, there are a number that sort of come to mind. Um, I think it's the people that you can work with and play with, if you know what I mean. It's more difficult to form those relationships today than in the past than it is today. Reason for that is I think a number of things. Obviously, again in the 80s and 90s and noughties, um, and in the marketplaces that I worked in. Um, Oil companies aside, because in the 80s, I worked a lot with BP in the 80s and 90s, and they were acutely aware that in some instances suppliers could use encouraging things like taking the client to a a rugby match in South Africa or going to the Hong Kong Sevens or something like that. And
Oh,
and yeah, so none of that happens. Very little of that happens now. There is still parts of organize of some market sectors that I'm not involved with anymore. Uh, so you can't even take somebody out to lunch to say thanks. That was a great implementation. It will work really well because if you're spending more than £50 on somebody for lunch, it has to be acknowledged. You'll have to excuse me.
yeah.
I've got a window cleaner cleaning my window. I don't know if you can hear that in the background. It's not.
No problem.
It's not a large cat trying to get in. He'll be gone in a second. Um, so um, so it is harder to strike up that business and sort of semi-profession or friendship. Obviously, COVID had a big driver on that as well, because a lot of people didn't go into the office for weeks, months, years. You're still seeing the remnants of that now in 2025, where I would say the vast majority of people only work in the office 3 days a week, and 2 days a week they're at home. So therefore, the opportunity to gel in the same way as we were able to gel in the past. And I'm not talking about, very definitely what I'm not talking about is bribing anybody, but just using the benefits of your organisation. If your organisation sponsored a rugby club and had a name on the shirt, which one of my employers had, local Bath rugby. We had a box and would encourage our customers to come and watch a game of rugby with us. Very difficult to do that now. And then if you're not outside of the work setting, if you go, how many offices do you go into these days and they don't have an office? It's all open plan. The classic example is in the city is Bloomberg. And Bloomberg had the most brilliant office in London, right in the middle of the city, and there isn't a single office that you can go to. So if Mike Bloomberg comes over, he actually has an office, but basically he doesn't want anybody to have meetings in offices where he can't be seen. So again, that's a real change and shift to what I grew through in those past decades. So I don't know if that sort of answers the question that you posed, but yeah, I mean, doing business today is changing, and it will continue to change and evolve. And I think, and I'm very much an analog person, if you like. I still would much, if we were not, a few continents apart, I'd much prefer to be sitting with you in an office doing this face to face than online. But again, we're doing it, and that's important. But I would have liked to have had a coffee with you. I've been drinking my coffee before we embarked on our cast. So
Exactly. I would also, I just like meeting people in person, but again, yeah, as you told, we're just continents apart. But anyway, the internet has connected us, and virtual
yes,
has actually made things possible.
yes, absolutely. So, but given a preference, that's my preference, and I think it's yours as well. And there's a few years
Yes,
between you and
absolutely.
me. But because it makes much more of a personal relationship that you build,
Exactly.
and I think probably more enduring as well, from having met somebody face to face. But that aside, we have to deal with what we have to deal with, don't we? Simple.
Yeah, that's how it is. It's what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one in that tenure where you were just giving the examples, like, would you like to mention the name of the leaders who have inspired you the most, or do you want to
Well,
just
I
say
mentioned a guy. I mentioned a guy, Nick Moulton. So he was my first manager when I joined Hamilton's on the 3rd of March 1980. I'm still very much in touch with him. And again, somebody that worked for me, that I then subsequently worked for. And I think who we're talking about, but
yes,
Matt
absolutely, I do.
Matt Brook,
Yeah.
who is the global head of sales for Yaxel. He worked for he worked for me in 2007, 8, 9, and then back in 2016, 17, 18, when he joined Appian. I then worked on a number of different programs for him um, up until last year. Again, and Matt is a really good guy. Very straightforward, very similar to me. Again, family principles, family first.
Absolutely. Yeah.
um, and somebody that I happily worked with and happily worked for. And I think it was more difficult for some people going, how can it be that you're happy to work? Well, quite easily, because basically he's offering me a position that I want to do, and I trust him, and he trusts me. So that's why things like that work. Also, clients that transitioned from one organization to another, and that again, because their principles were aligned to how I operated and how they wanted to bring to the new organization that they transitioned to, typically in an upward direction. That's been very, very useful. You're getting further up the tree, and as you go further up the tree, it makes doing business a lot easier, because they're typically talking to you with authority and the ability to say yes, rather than having to
Exactly.
go via a committee to get a
Yeah.
decision on whether or not. But there are, I would say there's a couple of handfuls of people that are go-to people for me today, that span those decades, and then newer people that you get involved with, that have something about them that you immediately identify with, that you go, bloody hell, I wish I wish I'd have known you 5 years before, because
Mhm.
gosh, we could have lit some fires, or but there's no point in looking backwards. We've got to look forward, and then just say, do you know what, where we are now is great. Think of the opportunities that we've got to go forward from there. So
Yeah.
so I'm often um, I'm often really heartened by that. And again, that's, as I said to you, that's for me all about fresh challenges and fresh
Exactly.
opportunities that come out of something new. Um, which is why I will carry on doing what I'm doing until I don't. Simple as that.
That's a very good motto, one. Every time you have to, try on new challenges, and when you take new risks, you understand
Yes.
the goodness of that. First,
Yes.
you'll have a pretty tough time when you're, embarking on that, but once you just get used to it, there's nothing like
Yeah.
that.
That's why you want to get up in the morning. I want to go and do what I do, and get those new experiences, and learn from them. And again, the honesty in that is sometimes you'll make the odd mistake, but if you own up to it and just say, well, I won't do it again, it's when you've made a mistake and then you make another mistake or another mistake,
Yeah,
that's when it all goes wrong. So learn from the experiences, and experiences more than mistakes, I'd say, to be honest. But it's
exactly.
learning how
Truly,
to
truly.
refine it, define it, and get it
Yeah.
get it better for the next time. Simple as that.
Absolutely. That's completely agreeable. So one, like before we, conclude our podcast segment, let's take a lighter route. We were just talking completely about the technical aspects about your journey
Yeah,
and
yeah.
all the key insights. So now one, we'll just, head on with a quick rapid fire. So one, now talking about this one, like, one, I'm pretty much sure that, you just love, motorsports. So if you would like to recommend a motorsport magazine, what would that magazine be to our listeners?
Autosport. Um, is I was, at the age of 11 and 12, Autosport was the motoring magazine, the weekly magazine that comes out, that gives you um, that gives you the insight, not just Formula One, but to all of the various different sides to motorsport, from rallying to the
Oh,
club racing, grassroots stuff. That for me has always been my go-to. I read it actually now online rather than having a physical copy, because it's I find it difficult to read. As you see, I have glasses, so I use digital technology to read it. But yeah, but it really gives you the. So I'm less interested in Formula One now than probably I have ever been. I'm more interested in grassroots motorsport. Cars in general. I think I alluded earlier, my dad was in the motor trade for 38 years. So I was at the age of 5, 6, 7, and through into my teenage years, I was going to motorsport events. I was going to Grand Prix. I was going to saloon car racing, and still do today. I mean, this weekend I'm going to something called the Bicester Heritage,
wow.
which is it's not a motor racing event. It's a meeting, effectively a car meeting for car enthusiasts, who will bring along their cherished possessions, and that will be anything from a a 5,000 or 7,000 pound Austin 7, to somebody that's going to turn up in a Bugatti Veyron, at several million pounds. I'm more interested in the Austin 7 than the Veyron.
Yeah.
But what it is a collection of people that love motoring, love motorsport, are true enthusiasts, that we can stand in what is an airfield, an old airfield, World War II airfield, just outside of Oxford on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, and talk rubbish about cars and racing, and a bit of Formula One, um, on Sunday. It's called the Bicester Heritage, and they do 3 events a year. And I one in January I went to, going to the April one. There's one in October that I go along to, and then there are other things, there are other events, and that I go to with some older cars, that I have access to. There's a couple of Jaguars that a friend of mine stores, and yeah, so that's for me. And again, at the Bicester Heritage on my son will be there, and my grandson will be there. My grandson is only 3, and
Okay.
he's got it in his DNA, through my father, through to me, through to my son, and now my grandson. So and again, I just love it. I love going to local events. I like going to national events. I probably like local events more, because you tend to see similar people at those events, or the same people at those events, turning up in whatever they turn up in, and having a bacon roll and a cup of coffee. Sometimes with the rain beating down on you, but that's the fun of it as well. That's the fun of it.
Absolutely. Totally, totally one. So now one, like, who is your favorite superhero growing up?
Hmm. So that's a tough question, actually. So define growing up. Between what ages, Akil?
I mean, you could just say, I mean, when you were a kid in school, and then, in your teens, probably, or you could just say, whoever is your favorite superhero till date. I think I could just rephrase the question that way.
Wow. There are a couple. That come to mind. Again, back in the sort of motor racing side of it. I mean, Graham Hill was champion. He was a bit of a character as well. He also was. People overuse the word legend. I don't know. I would actually say he was a legend, but did he did a couple of things in motorsport that few have been able to achieve. He was world champion twice over. He also won the Indianapolis 500. he also ran saloon car racing, Lotus Cortinas in the 60s. And he was a character. You could have him on a chat show, and he could recite stories that would have you creased up and laughing because the way in which he told it in a very self-effacing way. So he was somebody that I grew up with. Sadly, died in a plane crash, not in a racing car, in the 70s, I think, late 70s, very near to where we lived. So he's up there. Sportsman as such that sort of that sort of I particularly aligned to. Again, football for me, yeah, was quite important, but there were no particular people. If I was to think of one, maybe it would be somebody like George Best, in
Oh,
terms of his playing style and stuff like that you see these days, on black and white Pathé News type thing, and you go, blimey, that, or BBC rerun of some of his fabulous goals he scored. I mean, yeah, but I didn't particularly. He wasn't a hero because he was a bit of a flawed character. Many of the characters that you think were sort of, for some people, heroes were really quite challenged people because, again, and money is often the root of that, and that if you have too much money, you can do a number of things with money, can't you? You can maybe drink too much. And these days, there are other things that your money could go to that probably shouldn't. So yeah, there's again, I'm also trying to think about maybe an actor. The only other person that I've read, I've never read many books in my life because I'm dyslexic, and reading books is quite hard. But there was an actor that came up through the sort of British acting scene in the 50s and 60s, and his name was David Niven.
oh,
So he's a very famous, quite similar actually in character to Graham Hill, because he had a sort of a caddish, he had a moustache, and he spoke very well, and was very well connected and loved the finer things of life. And he wrote a book called The Moon is a Balloon.
yeah.
And I remember reading that as a teenager, and I couldn't wait to turn the next page because there was some story that he was reciting that typically was maybe a little bit risque, or self-effacing against him. So he was somebody that I thought, well, if I could be somebody else, I wouldn't mind being David Niven. Um, um, and he lived a pretty full life. I think he lived a pretty exciting life. He had yeah, and again, he was in, again, film star. There is nobody particularly today that, I'm in those days, stars were stars. Now they're very different, and that's all been brought about by social media, really, and how many squillions of followers you have on Instagram and stuff like that. In those days, none of that was available, so
Not at all.
you couldn't promote yourself other than doing what you needed to do on screen, or driving the car faster and winning championships and doing things like that. Today, you can be an influencer influencing on stuff that I have no idea what anybody's talking about, and be a multi-million, if not billionaire, before you're 20. So for me, I'm again, I've used the word analog a couple of times. I'm still very much analog as opposed to digital.
Got it, got it. So one, like you were just mentioning about autosport and your love towards motorsports. So one, what was the best road trip that you have ever experienced in your entire life, like till date?
Um, well, I've been to Le Mans a number of times, to the 24-hour race in Le Mans in France. I did it a couple of times in the early 90s, and I did it with friends when and where there were less restrictions than there are today. I've been lucky enough to go to Monaco, a couple of times. Again, once driving to Monaco, for the historic side of Monaco, not the F1 side of Monaco, and then once to go to an F1 race, where we drove, and that was, the trip through, right the way through France, right the way down to the Côte d'Azur and to Nice, and then to Monaco. Some of the roads, some of the passes, going up through Stabilo Pass, on the way back, some of those driving roads were fantastic. But also in the UK, some of the roads in the UK, some of the Welsh roads, for example, in North Wales, are quite fantastic, and Scotland as well. Going up onto the islands and going to Skye, and then up in and through, some most amazing scenery and coastal scenery in Scotland has been fantastic. So probably if I was to single one trip out, and that would have been to have gone to, an original Le Mans camping,
Okay.
building walls around your tents with the beer bottles that you had drunk from and were now spent, gives me big smiles on the basis of been there, done it. Can't really do it like that anymore. It's very much more corporate. So, and like going to Formula One racing now, I wouldn't turn down going if somebody said, would you like a ticket to go? I've been very lucky, and I've been guest of Ferrari and stuff like
Oh,
that. But that aside, it is now, grid walks is all about who can be on the grid, who's the most famous star that can walk down a grid that has nothing or no knowledge of even who is driving, that just sort of says, you know what, I've seen the best of it, and enjoyed the best of it.
absolutely.
But there was still an interest. But yeah, I'm glad I did what I did when I did it. Is probably how I would sum it up. And that, and what I still enjoy today, I still enjoy from, that stems from the past. As did my dad, and my son lives that out himself as well. So yeah, yeah,
Brilliant.
that's how I'd sum it up.
That's pretty good to know. One. So one, what is your favorite street food that you always keep on, having now and then?
Well, I mean, again, there's a lot more options to street food, than ever there was. No matter where you are, almost really. So if I'm in the city, there is very close to the Gherkin, in the city, and I think it's on the Tuesdays and the Thursdays. The street food around there is really phenomenal, and I typically gravitate towards sort of a Thai curry, or an Indian curry, um, and also in other parts of the city as well. The
Hmm.
is also fantastic as well. So again, the flaffles than carry on the move. So, but there's a lot of that now. I mean, again, that street food is really something that's really only gathered real, um, credibility, well, credibility in terms of the quality in the last 15 years, I would say. In the city, I can't think of any venue that street food, but now in various parts of the city, and even in set locations like Spitalfields Market, you can go into Spitalfields Market and literally eat around the world from street food, with no setup, direct setup kitchen. But yeah, so yeah, I think we very enjoy that. We don't necessarily have to go to Thailand to eat street food, but you've got a pretty good sense of it here, or need to go to India to get a good curry, so yeah.
It's all globalization, that's connecting the world
Yeah,
all
yeah,
together.
yeah, absolutely, and for risk of being boring, but sometimes nothing else hits the mark. But somebody can produce a really good burger. That has been a well-built burger, if you're hungry, is great. And I'll experience some of the street food options on Sunday when I go to Bicester Heritage, because there will be, you'll be able to eat around the world there on Sunday.
Absolutely. So, one, did you ever have a chance of, watching an Indian movie or, just seeing any Indian or hearing to any Indian song?
And the answer is yes and no, really. I've got a friend that has a Indian dance team. So his son and his daughter are set up, and the only experience I have had of so one, I've never seen an Indian movie from start to finish. I've seen extracts and stuff. This is the most I've been involved is with my friend Troop. That's the furthest extent that I can say that I have been to. One of the big regrets is I was invited to go to one of our ex-colleagues' wedding that was in India. So you probably remember
Oh,
Rahul. But that, again, big regret. I didn't go to an India because I think he had 3,500 people there, and it lasted over a week. I regret to say that I didn't go, but I regretted that I didn't go. I couldn't go, um, but because I'm completely, I know how it sort of pans out, but to experience it must be quite something, well, something very special, because it's so not how we do things in the UK. Although,
it's different. Yeah.
there's an area very close to me. So I live north of Luton. So there's a big Indian Asian mix, and there's a venue very close to me that can accommodate about. It's called the Marquee, and it can accommodate about 1,000 people. And regularly, I see that occupied from a Indian wedding. So I'm fascinated by India, and have enjoyed working. I enjoyed working with you guys. But no, I've not ever sat through. So unless you can give me a steer on which Indian film that I should watch, and I've seen extracts of, because the famous actors and actresses in Indian film are mega rich, very
Yeah.
accomplished actors and actresses. I'm aware of that, but it's something that's I've sort of brushed past, to be totally honest with you. And
Yeah.
you've never asked me that question before.
It's a new one I've arrived at, actually. So, one, thank you so much for, taking your time and, being part of my
You're
podcast
welcome.
initiative. And this is something, which I was actually, planning since a year. And finally, it just happened.
We did
And,
it.
you know,
We did
we
it.
did it. Exactly. We did it. And this collaboration really, really, means a lot to me. And so I really, really had a great time, conversing with you through this medium, especially when you were just giving me the heads up with respect to the storage management company and what's the relevance of it in today's
Welcome.
scenario. And along with that, your journey when you started in the 1980s, which was completely fascinating. And on top of that, you even told about that, you were selling and, renting mini computers. So that was
Yeah.
something which was, which I think our listeners would be very much curious if they would, if they would come more on that. So thank you so much once again for, taking time from your busy schedule.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome. It's been a pleasure, and I hope that what we've discussed today is an attraction to the listeners going forward when this pod is released.
Definitely, definitely. It's going to resonate with the people who are, who are going to hear to my podcast episode. So, listeners, before we conclude our podcast episode, this is an open request to all the industry leaders out there who are hearing to my podcast initiative. So, if you have any key useful journey or any interesting insight that you would like to share through my podcast episode, you could reach out to me on my email ID, akhil.navluri55@gmail.com, or message me on my WhatsApp number that's present on the profile page of my podcast channel. Or there's another option. You could DM DM me directly on my Instagram handle, the Techospace Podcast, and any key, any interesting journey or key useful insight, I would get back to you as soon as possible. And who knows, it's going to be you next time, the next industry leader that I would be conversing with. So on this note, this is your host Akhil Navluri signing off. We would be back with another podcast episode with another industry leader very soon. So till then, take care, keep listening, au revoir, and thank you. Goodbye. See you.